Hello. This summer we are taking a closer look at 1 Peter chapter 3. And this Sunday, as we get ready to transition into week 4 with our small groups and have an outreach experience, I want us to look at 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 10 through 17. And so I will be reading from the New International Version. For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are attentive to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats, do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against you, your good behavior in Christ, may be ashamed of their slander. For it is better if it is God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. Earlier in this passage, Peter calls us to live in harmony, not to seek revenge against one another. Peter in this passage is calling us to action. God doesn't just call us to be believers. He calls us to belong to a family of faith. He calls us to act with compassion. He calls us to act with kindness. He calls us to love our neighbor. Now, I recognize that this is a lot easier said than done. It's a lot easier to love your neighbor when you know them, when you have a relationship with them, when you share similarities with them. It's a lot harder to love your neighbor and to love the unknown. It's really easy to reject what we don't know. There are many psychological journals and social experiments that have explored this question of why do we gravitate towards those who are similar to us. And I think what a lot of psychologists have found is that there seems to be this perception. We have this perception that we share similarities with those. And so we gravitate to those that share things that we perceive are similar. And so I think that it's easy to bring this into our Christian lives. In fact, I am guilty of this myself. I have one group of Christian friends, and with this group of friends, I can engage in faith-based conversations and have these conversations about faith, about social justice, about racial reconciliation, and at times it's easier. And then I have another group of friends, and I don't even have to touch any of those subjects. And so what is unique about this current time that we are living in is that this passage calls us to action, and it calls us to reflect on what it means to live by faith. Verses 10 says, for whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. Peter wants us to reflect on what it means to see the good days. Is it a promise of good days for our future generations? Is it a promise of good days, say tomorrow, next week, next month? Is he referring to good days like eternity? I would suggest that it's all of the above. Peter is saying that if we want to see good days, there are very specific choices that we need to make today in how we live our lives. We simply can't afford to turn away and pretend it's not happening. We need to turn towards something. We need to turn towards Him. We need to believe in something. We need to stand our ground. For He's saying that when we are confronted with evil, our response as believers should be, what can I do? Where is the peace? How can I help create peace? Back in June, my husband and I went to a Black Lives Matter march in Bronzeville. But before going, we discussed the why behind it. Are we doing this because we are seeing our friends on Instagram, on Facebook, going to marches, and so we're just feeling the social pressure to participate? Are we going because this is something we really believe in? Are we going because we want to be agents of change and peace? And what does that peace and that change look like? Is it our Christian responsibility to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters? And so as we began to have this conversation, I began to have a lot of anxiety. For those of you who don't know, in March, I had an immigration interview for an adjustment status. I went from being DACA to being a U.S. permanent resident. And so I was really nervous. What happens if we don't make it home in time and we're caught and pulled over after curfew? What happens if we get separated? What happens if one of us gets injured? There's a pandemic going on. What does that even look like to protest right now? Should I pack my backpack with hand sanitizer, alcohol wipes, my CPR masks? What does it look like to participate? And so as the anxiety began rising, I realized I needed to take a breather and just pray. And after much prayer, I discerned that I am called to be an agent of peace. I'm called to use my privilege for those who don't have a voice. I want my children to grow up and not just feel compassion, but I want them to be compelled to do something about that compassion, not to just stay in that emotion. And so the only way to do that is to model that by being a living testimony. And so what choices can we make today that would lead us to good days? First, we must refuse to use our words to harm others, which is a great temptation. Even more so, we must turn away from our natural response of getting even. Turning away from evil to do good and to be an agent of peace is a lot more difficult than it is easy. Verses 13 through 15 remind me that it's not always going to feel good to do what is right. There will be some hurt that we need to endure. There will be some friends that will point at me. And during this time, myself and I have heard friends express that it's upsetting to sever ties with friendships because they are showing their true colors. It's not easy to engage in conversations when people are calling you out of your name, when people are calling you phony. It hurts even though you know that you are doing good. It's painful. And even though in that moment it hurts, that God is going to use that pain for you to grow and to understand that it is for our good. When you go through pain in spite of doing good, you become more flexible. It means that no matter what comes against you, no matter what attacks you, you affirm in your heart that Christ is Lord and that you are called to be an agent of peace. It's easy to want to get defensive when being attacked, but God calls us to explain our faith, to be hope dealers, to not be harsh or dismissive, not to be vindictive, to be insulting to those who disagree. So Peter says in verses 15 through 16, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander. In these verses, Peter gives us the tools that we need in how we should respond to that suffering. In verses 16 through 17, Peter explains why this attitude is key, why this posture is important. First of all, allowing us to keep a good conscience that we have not done or said the slightest thing to be hurtful. When it hurts and when we are being hurt or attacked, it's easy to become defensive and lose control of our tongue. Peter is saying, no matter what or who hurts you, live with a clear conscience. Verse 17 says, for it is better if it's God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. This verse sums it all up. He's saying, be eager for goodness. Don't be afraid. Be a hope dealer. Keep a pure conscience. Whatever the reason behind God's will, Peter is teaching us that it is much better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. A Christian suffering for Christ's sake and for his kingdom brings blessing to not just our lives, but to those around us for better days to come.